Late on the night of May 13, 2008, southwestern Minnesota carried the quietness typical of early spring in rural farm country. Broad, flat fields stretching into the darkness, gravel roads tracing long, straight lines between isolated farmhouses, and clusters of trees creating pockets of deeper shadow along the landscape. The air was cool, the sky clear, and only the faint hum of distant wind turbines and occasional passing vehicles disturbed the stillness. The region, sparsely populated and separated by miles of farmland, was the kind of environment where even a single pair of headlights could be seen traveling from far away, glowing across the plain like a moving star. In this quiet landscape, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was driving his Chevy Lumina home after spending the evening with friends in Lind, Minnesota. The roads he traveled were familiar gravel routes cutting through farmland, bordered by ditches, fields, and long stretches of open ground where cell service fluctuated unpredictably. The night was uneventful, with no significant weather concerns, no heavy traffic, and no indications that the drive would be anything other than a simple route back to his home in Marshall, about 20 minutes away. But somewhere along that rural path, his car left the roadway and slid into a shallow ditch, the wheels unable to gain traction in the loose soil and slope. Around 1:54 a.m., Brandon picked up his phone and called his parents, informing them that he had driven off the road and needed assistance. He described his surroundings calmly, explaining that he was near the town of Lind. His parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, left their home immediately, expecting they would quickly locate him by spotting his headlights along the roadside. As they drove through Lind and continued into nearby gravel roads, they searched the darkness for any sign of his vehicle. Brandon remained on the phone with them, attempting to guide them toward his location. The night was still, the roads empty, and the only source of sound inside the Swanson vehicle was Brandon's voice through the phone describing fence lines, field edges, and the faint outlines of landmarks visible in the darkness. Despite the familiarity of the area, his parents could not find him. They drove repeatedly along the routes he believed he was near, scanning ditches, farm entrances, and gravel turnoffs. Brandon continued describing his surroundings, but none of the details matched their actual position. After several minutes, both sides realized that Brandon was not where he believed he was. The rural layout miles of identical gravel roads intersecting at right angles, vast stretches of farmland without distinctive features and limited lighting made orientation difficult even for those familiar with the region. As the conversation continued, Brandon decided that his parents were searching in the wrong area. He told them he would walk toward the lights he could see in the distance, which he believed belonged to Lind. The landscape in that region allowed small towns to be mistaken for one another at night, due to the way light carries across open fields. Brandon's kept driving, talking to him continuously as he walked along the gravel road. The darkness around him was deep, illuminated only by the faint glow of small clusters of farm buildings, yard lights from distant houses, and the single beam of his cell phone screen. For nearly 47 minutes, Brandon remained on the phone with his parents, his footsteps audible through occasional static. He told them he was following the road and believed he would eventually reach a recognizable point. His parents continued driving through the area, making repeated passes along the roads they assumed he was on, headlights sweeping across gravel, grass, and open fields in the hope of spotting him walking along the shoulder. The landscape remained unchanging, long stretches of road bordered by fields, farm fences, and occasional drainage ditches. The silence of the early morning hours amplified every sound, from the crunch of gravel under Brandon's feet to the hum of the Swanson's engine as they drove slowly, windows open, listening for any hint of his location. Then, in the midst of their steady conversation, Brandon suddenly reacted to something near him. His voice shifted abruptly, and the only clear words he spoke were, "Oh, shorty teasy." After that, the line went silent. The call disconnected. His parents attempted to call back. The phone rang, but he did not answer. They called again, repeatedly, hoping the silence was only temporary, expecting him to pick up and explain what had startled him, but each call went unanswered. The phone continued to ring normally rather than going straight to voicemail, suggesting the device remained powered. But Brandon no longer responded. In the minutes that followed, the surrounding fields remained motionless. No sounds carried across the open landscape except the wind moving gently over the grass and the low hum of distant machinery. The Swansons continued driving, searching for any sign of movement or light that might indicate where he had walked. With no direction to follow and no response from Brandon, the search expanded into an open series of loops across the rural grid. They drove road after road, scanning every ditch, fence line, and turn-off, hoping to catch even a glimpse of their son's silhouette in the dark. By dawn, it was clear he had not returned home, had not walked into town, and had not made contact with anyone else. The area he had described during the call did not match the actual conditions around Lind. His car was eventually located, but in a completely different place from where he believed he was. The realization that he had been miles off course, walking alone in the darkness toward a destination he never reached, created an urgent mystery that would dominate the investigation. Brandon Swanson had vanished from an environment so open and empty that nearly everything was visible across long distances during daylight. Yet in the early morning darkness of May 14th, 2008, somewhere between the faint lights on the horizon and the long gravel roads stretching across farmland, he disappeared without leaving a trace. Brandon Swanson's life before his disappearance reflected the quiet stability of a small Midwestern community. Born and raised in Marshall, Minnesota, he grew up in an environment defined by close family ties, predictable routines, and the steady rhythm of rural life. His upbringing took place in a town where neighbors knew one another, where schools were central gathering points, and where the landscape consisted of long stretches of farmland punctuated by clusters of trees, grain silos, and the occasional rolling prairie. The region, shaped by agriculture and small-town infrastructure, fostered a sense of familiarity and straightforward daily patterns. From an early age, Brandon was known for his responsible nature and steady temperament. His teachers described him as attentive, polite, and consistently dependable. He participated actively in classroom discussions, performed well academically, and maintained good relationships with peers. His personality leaned toward calmness and practicality, qualities that reflected both his environment and the values instilled by his family. Friends noted that he approached tasks methodically, rarely rushing, and often taking time to consider details. These traits followed him into adulthood, forming the basis of his work ethic and approach to education. Brandon's family environment further supported this stability. His parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, nurtured an atmosphere of reliability and communication. They maintained structured routines, balanced work and family responsibilities, and fostered independence in their children while remaining closely connected. The Swanson home reflected typical Midwestern modesty, comfortable, orderly, and centered around shared meals, conversations, and daily responsibilities. Brandon's relationship with his parents was grounded in mutual respect, open communication, and trust. They were accustomed to discussing schedules, plans, and expectations, and Brandon consistently kept them informed about his activities and academic commitments. His familiarity with rural Minnesota extended beyond his home life. He knew the local roads, the types of fields that surrounded them, and the small communities that dotted the region. He understood the way cell service varied unpredictably across farmland, the changing conditions of gravel roads depending on weather, and the way town lights could appear deceptively close or distant depending on the landscape. Growing up in such an environment meant knowing that quiet roads could feel isolating at night, and that a single wrong turn could lead miles away from the intended route without obvious indicators. After graduating high school, Brandon enrolled at Minnesota West Community and Technical College, pursuing studies in wind turbine technology. an emerging and relevant field in the region. The growing presence of wind farms across the Midwestern plains made this an increasingly practical career choice, and Brandon approached the program with the same focus he had demonstrated throughout his schooling. His instructors observed that he was capable, organized, and attentive to the technical details of his coursework. He balanced his academic responsibilities with part-time employment, managing both effectively. His daily routines were uncomplicated and consistent. He attended classes, completed coursework, spent time with friends, and returned home regularly to share updates with his family. His social life was typical of a college student, in small-town gatherings at friends' homes, weekend activities, and occasional outings in nearby communities. He was known to be reliable among his peers, someone who followed through on commitments and maintained steady friendships. Those who interacted with him regularly described him as level-headed, mature for his age, and not prone to impulsive decisions. Despite the normality of his daily life, Brandon possessed a strong sense of independence. He managed his responsibilities without requiring close oversight, stayed organized in his academic work, and handled transportation and scheduling without issue. He drove often, navigating rural roads with familiarity. His parents trusted his judgment, which made his late-night call for assistance on May 13th particularly unusual. He rarely needed help with roadside issues or directions. The fact that he called home and remained in contact for nearly an hour reflected his expectation that the situation was manageable, even though he had misjudged his location. Brandon's sense of responsibility extended to his education. As the spring semester neared its end, he had completed his coursework and looked forward to the next stage of his academic path. He maintained regular communication with classmates, discussing assignments, exams, or the break. Nothing in his academic performance or personal behavior suggested any instability or conflict. In the days leading up to his disappearance, he attended classes, met with friends, and followed routine schedules patterns that would later help investigators establish his mental and emotional baseline. The environment in which Brandon lived further shaped his understanding of rural navigation. Southwestern Minnesota consisted of expansive farmland, divided by straight, grid-like gravel roads that extended for miles with few landmarks. These roads often lacked signage, and at night, without distinctive reference points, the vast uniformity of the fields made orientation difficult. Even experienced drivers could become disoriented when relying solely on visual cues in darkness, especially when distant town lights appeared on the horizon. Brandon's familiarity with the region gave him confidence, but the conditions that night, quiet roads, limited visibility, and the monotony of the terrain could easily lead to mistaken assumptions about location. His family later described him as someone who understood responsibility and safety, making his unexpected disappearance even more difficult to reconcile with his known behavior. There was no indication that he intended to travel long distances or deviate significantly from his planned route that night. His decision to walk toward what he believed were town lights was consistent with the practical reasoning he applied to everyday situations. He trusted his ability to navigate familiar environments, even at night. What he could not anticipate, however, was how easily distance and direction could become distorted in the rural darkness, especially in a region where miles of farmland separated small pockets of civilization. On the evening before he disappeared, Brandon followed a normal pattern. He attended a small gathering, interacted casually with friends, and left without incident. There were no signs of conflict, distress, or unusual behavior. His plan was straightforward: to return home after socializing. The drive should have been simple, requiring only a short distance along quiet roads connecting Lind and Marshall. Nothing about the night suggested danger or unpredictability. That context, the stable background, the steady temperament, the predictable routines, formed the foundation investigators later relied upon when attempting to understand the events that unfolded during the early hours of May 14th. Brandon Swanson lived a life without volatility, without sudden behavioral shifts, and without hidden complications. His disappearance did not fit the patterns associated with voluntary vanishing or spontaneous life changes. Instead, it emerged abruptly from an otherwise ordinary landscape, disrupting a life defined by structure and consistency. When Brandon Swanson did not return home by morning on May 14, 2008, the situation shifted rapidly from parental concern to an active missing person case. His parents began the day by retracing the same roads they had searched only hours earlier, driving through Lind along nearby gravel routes and into rural corridors that connected the surrounding fields. The early daylight offered clearer visibility than the night before, but despite the improved conditions, there was no sign of Brandon walking along the roadside. The fields remained empty, the ditches undisturbed, and the gravel road showed no trace of recent foot traffic. Shortly after sunrise, the Lyon County Sheriff's Office initiated the first stage of the investigation. Deputies arrived at the Swanson home to gather initial information, details about Brandon's last known location, the content of his late-night phone call, the direction he believed he was heading, and the areas his parents had already searched. Law enforcement began by identifying all roads near Lind that matched the type Brandon had described during the 47-minute phone call. Officers drove through these roads slowly, checking ditches, culverts, and field entrances for signs of movement or disturbance. While the parents' search during the night had focused on the Lind area, investigators recognized early that one of the most important tasks was determining where Brandon actually had been. The vague descriptions he had given during the phone call, fences, gravel roads, distant lights, fit dozens of locations across the county. With no precise coordinates and no distinctive landmarks, deputies had to consider the possibility that Brandon had been miles away from where he assumed. Later that morning, one of the deputies located a vehicle matching the description of Brandon's Chevy Lumina. The car was not near Lind. Instead, it was discovered outside the small town of Taunton, nearly 25 miles away from the area Brandon believed he had been close to. The position of the car placed him farther north and west than anyone had expected. It rested partly off a gravel road, tilted slightly where the wheels had slipped into a shallow ditch. The vehicle showed no damage that indicated a collision, only the typical signs of a car that had lost traction on loose gravel. The headlights were off and the doors were closed. Nothing inside the vehicle appeared disturbed. His keys were not found at the scene, and there were no footprints identifiable in the gravel or the surrounding soil. The discovery of the car immediately altered the direction of the investigation. The shift from Lind to Taunton was significant. The distance suggested Brandon had misinterpreted his location throughout the entire phone call with his parents. In rural Minnesota, lights visible across miles of open farmland can make towns appear deceptively close, and the flat terrain often makes distances difficult to judge in darkness. Investigators now understood that the phone call had taken place while Brandon walked in an area none of them had been searching. With the new location established, search operations increased in scale. Deputies coordinated a grid-based search around the vehicle, focusing initially on a 1-mile radius. Volunteers, officers, and personnel from local fire departments walked slowly through fields planted with early corn, the soil soft and uneven underfoot. They examined drainage ditches, culverts that ran beneath gravel roads, and agricultural structures situated along the perimeter of fields. The area was dotted with farm driveways, machinery storage shelters, and tree clusters, each one carefully examined for signs that someone had passed through during the night. Water sources in the area became immediate focal points. Creeks and drainage channels, swollen slightly from spring moisture, cut through the landscape in irregular patterns. These waterways, bordered by grass and reeds, could obscure footprints or personal items. Search teams moved methodically along these channels, inspecting water depth, banks, and debris. Despite extensive effort, nothing connected to Brandon was found. The absence of clothing, objects, or disturbed vegetation suggested that he had not remained near the car long after leaving it. During the early afternoon, investigators contacted phone service providers to retrieve technical information about Brandon's final call. Cell tower records indicated that his phone had last connected to a tower northeast of Porter, Minnesota, consistent with the location of his vehicle, but not consistent with Lind, where he believed he had been. The tower data allowed investigators to establish a rough map of his possible movements. This geographical analysis showed that Brandon had likely been walking in a northwest direction during the call, heading through agricultural land, rather than toward the town he thought he was approaching. The discrepancy between Brandon's perceived direction and his actual location became one of the most significant early findings. It explained why his parents had been unable to locate him during the night, despite passing repeatedly along the roads where they believed he was walking. The physical separation between Brandon's belief and reality meant that the 47-minute phone conversation occurred while he was moving steadily through dark, unfamiliar territory without realizing he was miles off course. As investigators expanded the search outward from the vehicle, they faced the challenges characteristic of rural environments. The fields surrounding the car were vast and uniform, with few natural barriers to guide someone walking at night. The gravel roads intersected at right angles in long, repeating patterns. Ditches alongside the roads varied in depth, some shallow and grassy, others deeper and lined with loose soil. The early spring fields, not yet fully grown, offered little obstruction but also few indicators of disturbance. Tracks left by animals, deer, raccoons, and farm dogs marked the soil, complicating efforts to identify fresh footprints. Search teams followed likely paths based on the direction Brandon might have walked from the vehicle. They moved in straight lines across the fields, examining the ground for impressions in the soil. Helicopters from the State Patrol flew overhead, using thermal imaging equipment to scan for heat signatures or irregularities. But the timing made the technology less effective. Hours had passed since Brandon had been in the area, and the warm ground near dawn reduced the contrast required for detection. As evening approached on May 14th, the search widened further. Deputies coordinated with neighboring counties, expanding the radius to include additional gravel roads and field sections. Canine teams attempted to track a scent from the vehicle, but the combination of wind, open fields, and time elapsed weakened the effectiveness of the dogs. Tracks on gravel roads proved unreliable. The mix of dust and stone preserved impressions poorly, and passing traffic quickly disrupted anything that might have been present during the night. During these early search efforts, investigators also examined the possibility that Brandon might have fallen into a concealed area or suffered an accident in the dark. Rural landscapes contain features that are not visible at night: steep field drop-offs, water-filled drainage tiles, old farm wells, and unused pits from abandoned agricultural activity. Teams checked these areas carefully, probing with long poles and inspecting interior spaces of structures that stood along field boundaries. None showed signs of disturbance. The investigation continued into the following days with the same level of urgency. Search grids expanded to township boundaries. Volunteers from multiple counties joined the effort, walking in coordinated lines through fields that extended for miles. Law enforcement checked abandoned buildings, farm equipment shelter areas, and tree lines repeatedly. Aerial searches were conducted again under different light conditions. Despite this extensive coverage, the fields remained undisturbed, and the roads offered no evidence of travel beyond the vehicle's final resting place. During this phase, investigators recognized that the final minutes of the phone call held particular significance. His abrupt response, followed by silence, suggested that something had occurred suddenly, but the environment provided no indication of what that event might have been. The absence of physical evidence around the vehicle reinforced the idea that whatever happened occurred at a distance from the car, likely along the route he had been walking while on the phone. By the end of the initial stage of the investigation, One conclusion had become central. Brandon had been nowhere near the place he believed he was during his call, and his disappearance had occurred in a region vast enough to obscure signs of his passage, yet open enough that his absence remained difficult to reconcile with the lack of physical evidence. The rural landscape, deceptively simple from above, had transformed into a complex environment where distance, darkness, and uniformity combined to erase the path of a young man walking alone in the early hours of the morning. In the days that followed the discovery of Brandon Swanson's vehicle, the search operation expanded into one of the largest coordinated efforts the region had seen in years. Early searches had focused on the immediate vicinity of the car, but as investigators accepted that Brandon had been walking for nearly an hour after leaving the vehicle, the geographic scope of the operation widened substantially. The landscape stretched outward in every direction, thousands of acres of farmland, intersecting gravel roads, drainage ditches, tree lines, and scattered clusters of buildings. The vastness of the area made it necessary to break the search into multiple zones, each assigned to different teams working simultaneously. Law enforcement agencies from surrounding counties joined the effort, supported by fire departments, trained search volunteers, and local residents familiar with the terrain. The region's open fields, often deceptively uniform, required a structured approach. Grid patterns were created using maps that divided the farmland into sections based on natural and man-made boundaries, roads, field edges, drainage channels, and property lines. Search teams walked slowly through each grid, maintaining straight lines and consistent spacing to ensure the ground was examined with precision. Despite their thorough progress, the fields revealed no clothing, no personal belongings, and no signs that anyone had passed through recently. The early searchers quickly realized that the terrain's simplicity was deceptive. From above, the fields appeared flat and open, but once on the ground, variations emerged: uneven soil, low dips that weren't visible from the road, narrow channels where water collected, and pockets of tall grass that could conceal items despite appearing sparse from a distance. Searchers walked through wide plowed fields where the soil had been turned for planting, the uneven ground making every step deliberate. They continued through fields in which early spring crops had begun to sprout, brushing aside short plants to ensure nothing lay hidden between the rows. Attention turned quickly to water sources, which posed some of the most significant challenges in rural search operations. Several drainage ditches ran through the area, varying in depth and width. Some held water accumulated from recent spring rainfall, while others were dry or contained only shallow puddles. Teams walked along the length of these channels, probing deeper pockets and inspecting bends where debris collected. Larger creeks and narrow streams required additional equipment. In those areas, searchers used shallow draft boats, dragging tools, and long poles to examine the bottom. The water was often murky and slow-moving, making visibility minimal, despite the possibility that a person could have slipped into the water while walking in darkness. No evidence surfaced during any of the aquatic searches. As grid searches continued, canine units were brought in again, this time with more specialized tracking dogs trained to detect human scent across long distances. Handlers worked the dogs near the location of the vehicle, hoping to pick up a direction of travel that matched the phone call timeline. The dogs briefly followed general paths along gravel roads, but could not maintain consistent tracks. Searchers recognized that the conditions on the night of the disappearance, open fields, steady winds, and hours elapsed, reduced the likelihood of a successful scent trail. Gravel surfaces, which do not hold impressions well and cannot retain scent as effectively as soil, further complicated the process. While canine efforts provided some directional indicators, none led to a definitive route. During this stage of the investigation, officers and volunteers examined farm structures located within a several-mile radius of the vehicle. These included machine sheds, grain bins, abandoned barns, and open-sided storage shelters scattered across farmland. Each structure required careful inspection. Searchers looked inside equipment, checked corners and loft areas, and walked along the perimeters of buildings. Some older structures, unused for years, contained debris that made examinations slow and meticulous. Despite the thoroughness of these efforts, none contained signs of disturbance. Investigators then began to form early theories about what might have happened based on the environmental context, timeline, and discovery pattern. One possibility they considered was that Brandon had encountered an unexpected hazard, such as a sudden drop-off, a hidden culvert, or an unlit waterway during his walk. The abruptness of his final words on the phone suggested a sudden event, but no physical hazard along the searched routes showed signs of such an incident. Another theory proposed that he had become disoriented, walked in an unintended direction, and reached a zone outside the current search boundaries. Given the scale of rural Minnesota farmland, even a slight directional error could place someone miles away from the expected route. The open grid of roads created equal possibilities in multiple directions, and the lack of identifiable visual markers at night increased this risk. A third theory examined the prospect of environmental exposure. Although the temperature that night was not extreme, prolonged exposure in rural areas, especially if he had been injured or unable to continue walking, could lead to serious consequences. Search teams examined natural depressions in the ground, areas where tall grass grew thicker, and any spot where someone could have collapsed unseen from the roadside. Despite these examinations, no trace emerged. As searches expanded outward, investigators also considered whether there had been any interactions between Brandon and others during the early morning hours. They checked with residents living along nearby roads and farm driveways. Deputies knocked on doors, speaking to anyone who might have been awake or heard unusual sounds. Most residents reported that the night had been silent, with no movement outside and no disturbances. No one had seen a young man walking or heard anything unusual around the time the phone call ended. As days passed, aerial searches were conducted again, using helicopters equipped with imaging systems capable of detecting irregularities in the ground. These flights covered wide distances across farmland, scanning for patterns that could indicate movement or collapsed soil which would appear differently from undisturbed land. The aerial imaging found no areas of concern. Investigators also explored whether Brandon might have reached a road outside of the search perimeter and been picked up by a passing vehicle. Rural roads see limited traffic at those hours, but the possibility remained. To evaluate this, officers contacted drivers whose routes might have intersected with the relevant area. Truckers, early shift workers, and nearby residents were questioned. None reported seeing a pedestrian walking along the roads at that time. No reports of suspicious vehicles or unusual stops were documented, and there was no indication that Brandon had interacted with anyone else. As searches continued for several days, the scale of manpower, equipment, and land coverage increased exponentially. Volunteers walked miles across fields daily, often returning at sunset after hours of slow, careful movement. Law enforcement reviewed maps repeatedly, marking searched grids, narrowing possible routes, and noting every area already cleared. Despite the systematic nature of the operation, the lack of results posed a growing challenge. The farmland seemed endless, and every direction offered more ground to cover. Eventually, after multiple days of continuous searching, it became apparent that the immediate area surrounding the vehicle had been examined thoroughly. The absence of any physical evidence in the vicinity raised the possibility that Brandon had traveled a significant distance before the phone call ended. The time factor, nearly an hour of walking, supported this. Investigators now faced a new question. While the vehicle had provided a starting point, where along that 47-minute path had the disappearance occurred, and how far outward from that point could he have traveled? Each possibility required new search grids, new maps, and new patterns. The investigation entered a stage where every direction, every road, and every field became part of a widening radius, defined not by clues but by the mathematical estimation of how far a person could walk in that time frame. As the early grid searches concluded without results, investigators recognized that locating Brandon Swanson would require expanding the operation far beyond the region surrounding his abandoned vehicle. The nearly hour-long phone call with his parents indicated that he had covered a significant distance on foot before the line disconnected, and in a rural landscape where each mile of farmland could stretch uninterrupted to the horizon. This fact extended the search perimeter dramatically. The team now faced a new challenge, determining how far a person could travel in the time Brandon was walking and what areas that distance would encompass. The first step in this phase involved calculating the approximate radius based on an average walking speed over uneven terrain at night. Investigators estimated that Brandon could have covered between 2 to 4 miles, depending on the condition of the roads, the visibility, and the certainty of his direction. However, the terrain he crossed was unlikely to be uniform gravel roads alone. His steps would have taken him across grassy ditches, patches of uneven soil, and possibly through cultivated fields or along fence lines that did not follow straight paths. These variables widened the possible area even further. If he left the road at any point or walked diagonally across a field, rather than following the grid-like road network, the radius expanded into multiple square miles of open land. With these estimates in mind, search teams extended their operations outward, creating new grid sections that spanned across county lines. The landscape west and north of Taunton offered a mix of farmland, narrow waterways, windbreak tree lines, and small patches of wooded areas that broke the uniformity of the fields. Searchers walked through private farmlands with permission from property owners who cooperated fully, opening gates and providing information about the layout of their land. In many cases, farmers joined the search themselves, driving ATVs or walking the perimeter of their property to support efforts. Despite the collaborative approach, the terrain remained vast, and even with dozens of people covering different sections, the area seemed to expand faster than it could be searched. Investigators consulted with environmental experts familiar with rural Minnesota landscapes. These specialists helped identify hazards that might not be immediately obvious: old agricultural pits hidden beneath tall grasses, deep drainage tiles covered by metal grates, abandoned wells that had not been filled properly, and old farm structures that could collapse or conceal movement. The region's history of farming and land use created a patchwork of potential dangers that varied from property to property. Search teams examined these features carefully, checking for any signs that someone might have fallen into or become trapped within them. In every case examined, the structures showed no recent disturbance, and none contained relevant clues. Another focus during this period involved the waterways that intersected the farmland. The Yellow Medicine River and its tributaries flowed through the region, winding through fields and forming natural corridors that could be hazardous at night. Investigators revisited these waterways with renewed focus, walking their banks and using poles to probe deeper sections. While the rivers were not at flood levels, their banks were often slippery, and the water depth varied unpredictably due to the season. Additionally, smaller drainage channels and irrigation ditches created narrow, fast-moving streams that could pose a risk. Despite extensive checks, none of the waterways revealed evidence of Brandon's presence. Consultations extended to experts in search and rescue operations who had worked on other rural missing person cases. These specialists noted that open farmland, despite appearing easier to search than wooded or mountainous terrain, created challenges due to its size, the uniformity of the landscape, and the lack of shelter or man-made structures that could provide clues. In areas like southwestern Minnesota, a person walking in darkness without clear landmarks could easily become disoriented. This insight aligned with the earlier discovery that Brandon had misjudged his location entirely during the call, believing he was near Lind while being miles away. The possibility that he had walked in a direction almost perpendicular to his intended route became increasingly plausible. Psychological profiling experts were consulted to determine whether Brandon's communication during the call suggested confusion, distress, or impaired orientation. Analysis of the call details, based on his parents' descriptions of his tone and clarity, suggested that he was coherent, communicative, and aware of what he believed he was doing. There was no indication that his judgment had been significantly impaired. What remained consistent in these assessments was that his misinterpretation of his location stemmed from environmental factors, not cognitive ones. The flat terrain, widely spaced lights, and lack of distinctive features at night contributed significantly to this confusion. During this extended search period, law enforcement re-evaluated each theory that had emerged. The possibility of foul play remained a consideration, but lacked evidence. There were no signs of a struggle near the vehicle or indications that another party had been present. Brandon had not mentioned seeing other people or vehicles during the call. The region where the car was found was extremely rural, with minimal traffic at that hour. No reports indicated suspicious activity. The absence of any belongings, damage, or signs of confrontation at the vehicle further diminished the likelihood of a criminal encounter occurring at or near the car. Investigators also examined the possibility that Brandon had continued walking beyond the estimated radius, possibly in an unexpected direction. In rural search operations, even minor miscalculations in distance or timing could create large gaps between expected and actual locations. If Brandon had left the road at any point, whether to cut across a field or to reach the lights he saw, his path could have been irregular rather than linear. This factor pushed the search perimeter outward, requiring teams to examine new areas that extended in a widening arc around the original grid. As searchers covered more ground, the absence of physical evidence became increasingly notable. No clothing caught on fences, no footprints identifiable in the soil, no personal items dropped along the roads or fields. In typical cases, even subtle traces can offer direction: disturbed grass, impressions near ditches, or items inadvertently lost during travel. Here, none appeared. The terrain, despite its openness, yielded no signs at all. Investigators began marking sections of land as cleared, knowing that each area removed from consideration reduced the available possibilities, but did not bring them closer to understanding what had happened. Throughout this phase, the Swanson family remained closely involved. They participated in community search efforts, attended briefings with law enforcement, and worked with volunteers who continued to search on their own time. The community's response was extensive, with residents joining searches, offering land access, and providing logistical support. Despite the strong cooperation, the vastness of the territory made it impossible to guarantee complete coverage. As the search entered deeper into rural areas, investigators noticed a shift in the nature of the operation. What had begun as a structured grid search around a known point had evolved into a large-scale, open-ended exploration of farmland with few guiding indicators. This transition marked one of the most difficult phases of the investigation. With each completed search area, the realization grew that the explanation for Brandon's disappearance might lie beyond the boundaries of even the expanded grids. As the weeks passed and the expanding search efforts continued to yield no physical evidence, investigators faced the growing challenge of sustaining momentum while managing the increasing uncertainty surrounding the case. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson had already departed from the patterns seen in most rural missing person cases, and the lack of clues, no clothing, belongings, footprints, or signs of struggle marked the investigation as highly unusual. Law enforcement agencies continued working with persistence, but as search grids extended further outward, the absence of new leads became increasingly significant. The next stage of the investigation involved revisiting the technical data surrounding the disappearance. Detectives returned to the cell tower records, reviewing them with specialists familiar with network behavior in rural regions. The previous analysis had indicated that Brandon's phone connected to a tower near Porter, Minnesota, but investigators now sought to refine the geographical implications of that connection. Experts explained that tower coverage in rural areas often spans wide, irregularly shaped regions due to the lack of interference from buildings or terrain. A single tower could reach miles across open farmland, and the signal footprint could fluctuate depending on the height of crops, humidity levels, and other environmental conditions present that night. To narrow the possible walking route further, investigators requested more detailed data regarding signal strength and sector orientation. While the provider could confirm the general direction of the tower sector the phone used, the available information still did not pinpoint an exact location. The uncertainty remained substantial. Brandon could have been anywhere within a large pie-slice-shaped zone extending outward from the tower. The refined analysis did little to reduce the search radius. Instead, it confirmed that the area already being searched was appropriate, but still overwhelmingly large. At the same time, investigators examined the final moments of the phone call again, attempting to determine whether the abrupt exclamation before the line disconnected could offer insight into what happened. While the words themselves indicated a sudden event, the nature of that event remained indeterminate. Experts suggested several possibilities: a misstep into uneven ground, a fall into a ditch, an encounter with a concealed obstacle, or even a drop in cell signal at the exact moment he reacted to something in his surroundings. None of these possibilities could be confirmed without physical evidence, and the lack of such evidence left them as theories rather than conclusions. Environmental hazards were reconsidered during this phase. Rural Minnesota hosts numerous hidden features created over decades of agricultural use, returning water lines, tiling systems, old wells, and drainage points hidden beneath vegetation. While many had been inspected, investigators broadened their search to include deeper probes into soil depressions, culverts extending further under roads, and older farm structures located beyond the initial radius. Each of these required time-consuming inspection. Searchers used metal detectors in areas where objects might have become buried beneath soil or debris, and investigators brought in specialized equipment to examine subsurface features more thoroughly. None of these efforts revealed anything related to the case. As investigators pressed deeper into the rural landscape, they also began to examine long-term hazards, areas where someone might fall, become trapped, or become immobile without leaving visible traces. Some natural features, such as isolated pockets of dense vegetation or areas where tall grass grew around drainage paths, could conceal someone even in relatively open terrain. Teams walked through these regions slowly, parting grass with poles to check the ground beneath. But again, no evidence surfaced. Each completed area, while important to eliminate, added to the growing list of locations where Brandon was not. During this expanding investigative phase, law enforcement also received an increasing number of tips from the public. Local residents, people who had been traveling through the region on the night of May 13th, and individuals from surrounding counties called to offer information. Some believed they had seen a person walking along a road, though these sightings often proved unrelated or occurred at times inconsistent with the disappearance. Others reported hearing something unusual during the night, such as a distant sound or movement near their property. But none of these accounts were supported by physical evidence. Investigators documented and followed each tip, but they consistently reached dead ends. Public speculation also grew as the case gained more attention. Community members discussed theories, examining possibilities such as disorientation, environmental accidents, or even the involvement of another vehicle. However, speculation rarely aligned fully with the known facts, and investigators remained focused on verified evidence. The absence of confirmed sightings beyond the phone call remained one of the case's most perplexing elements. In most rural missing person cases, someone sees movement, hears something, or notices lights at an unusual time. Here, there were no confirmed observations after the phone went silent. As the case advanced, investigators reviewed whether Brandon might have attempted to take a shortcut across farmland rather than staying on the road. This was consistent with the idea that he was walking toward lights, he believed were part of a town. If those lights appeared close in the darkness, he might have chosen a direct line rather than following the grid of roads. Such a route would take him across uneven ground, fences, and planted fields. Searchers examined these kinds of paths, walking long distances in straight lines across open terrain, checking for signs of trampled vegetation or disturbed soil. But without fresh footprints or identifiable traces, determining a precise path after so much time had passed was nearly impossible. Law enforcement then considered nighttime visibility factors more carefully. Experts noted that in rural landscapes, the human eye is easily deceived by horizon lights. A farm's yard light, a distant town's glow, or even the reflected headlights of occasional vehicles might appear as stable points of reference. In darkness, with minimal contrast and few structural landmarks, misjudging distance is extremely common. This phenomenon aligned with the earlier conclusion that the lights Brandon saw may not have been lit at all. The possibility that he had been walking toward a farm or a smaller cluster of homes miles away remained plausible. This factor complicated the search further, creating multiple potential destinations for his final route. Alongside environmental considerations, investigators revisited early assumptions about the timing of the phone call. They evaluated whether the abrupt end to the call indicated an immediate hazard or simply a technical disruption. In rural areas, signal fluctuations can cause sudden disconnections, and the final moment of the call could have been coincidental rather than indicative of a sudden accident. However, investigators could not dismiss the possibility that something occurred at that exact moment. The words spoken before the disconnection continued to carry weight, reflecting the sudden and unexplained nature of the final event. As days turned into weeks, the search effort faced the slow onset of investigative fatigue. Volunteers who had spent extensive hours walking fields began to shift their focus back to daily responsibilities. Though many continued searching independently on weekends, law enforcement maintained their commitment, but the absence of progress required re-evaluating strategies. Meetings were held regularly to determine which areas still needed coverage, which techniques could be introduced, and how resources should be allocated. Despite the ongoing work, the open farmland continued to bear no traces of Brandon's presence. During this phase, investigators came to understand that the lack of evidence was becoming one of the central features of the case. The disappearance had no physical indicators at the scene, no clear direction of travel, and no confirmed interactions beyond the phone call. Unlike typical missing person cases, where at least one or two clues provide direction, every potential lead, in this case, faded upon examination. The investigation expanded outward in every direction, but each expansion only emphasized the enormity of the land and the absence of definitive markers. As the immediate search period transitioned into the summer months, the investigation into Brandon Swanson's disappearance entered a new and more complex phase. With the initial grids exhausted and the primary area around his abandoned vehicle thoroughly examined, law enforcement shifted attention toward long-term strategies that accounted for environmental changes, seasonal variation, and renewed opportunities for evidence to emerge. Rural landscapes transform noticeably with time. Crops grow taller, waterways fluctuate, and vegetation thickens, altering visibility and coverage. Investigators understood that features concealed in early spring might become noticeable later in the year, prompting them to schedule additional search efforts timed with these natural shifts. One of the first adjustments involved returning to waterways at times when water levels fluctuated. As summer progressed, certain creeks, drainage channels, and low-lying areas experienced periods of reduced water flow. Search teams revisited these sites, examining banks where receding water had exposed new soil and debris. They probed deeper areas manually and visually inspected sections that had previously been too submerged to search effectively. The Yellow Medicine River, which had been a priority area in earlier searches, was combed again with specialized teams. They walked both upstream and downstream, from previously examined points, checking bends, oxbows, and areas where currents slowed. Despite these renewed efforts, no evidence surfaced, and the river remained as uninformative as it had been in the initial stages. As vegetation filled in across farmland, visibility changed dramatically. Cornfields that had been only a few inches tall in May grew into dense, towering rows by midsummer, altering the dynamic of search operations. Investigators recognized that the height and density of the crops would now conceal more ground, but could also preserve evidence that might have been overlooked earlier. Teams returned to these fields, walking between the rows, sweeping the soil with long poles, and scanning for anything that might have been missed in the earlier passes. The process was time-consuming, and the uneven terrain created natural obstacles, but the area remained devoid of relevant findings. During this period, cadaver dogs were deployed again. These dogs, trained to detect the scent associated with human remains, were brought in from specialized units capable of working in open, rural environments. Handlers moved systematically through fields, along tree lines, and near waterways, allowing the dogs to pick up scents carried by shifting summer winds. Several search passes were conducted under varying conditions, morning, midday heat, and cooler evening hours. To maximize the chances of detection, the dogs alerted on a few areas, but upon closer examination, these alerts were determined to be unrelated to the case. In open landscapes, organic materials, animal remains, and changes in soil composition can occasionally influence scent-based searches. None of the alerts provided actionable information about Brandon's location. Investigators also returned to farm structures across the broader region. Summer weather allowed for easier access to older barns, sheds, and outbuildings that had been less accessible during earlier months due to unstable ground or muddy terrain. These structures were inspected again, with teams focusing on loft areas, crawl spaces, and storage sections where tools or equipment had been moved since the spring. The renewed inspections ensured that no area was overlooked due to earlier limitations. Despite the expanded access, none of the structures revealed signs of human activity or disturbance. As time progressed, investigators consulted additional experts who specialized in rural missing person cases. These specialists reviewed search maps, environmental data, and the timeline of the phone call. They noted that the combination of darkness, uneven terrain, and lack of landmarks made it highly likely that Brandon had walked in a direction that differed from what he believed. They emphasized that rural landscapes can cause individuals to drift off intended paths without realizing it, especially at night. This insight supported theories that Brandon might have walked beyond the search grids that were initially prioritized. Psychological profiling also entered the investigation, though its purpose was not to speculate on Brandon's intentions, but to confirm whether his behavior during the call was consistent with someone experiencing disorientation or distress. Analysis concluded that his communication had remained coherent and logical. He gave clear descriptions, maintained steady conversation, and expressed frustration rather than confusion. His final words indicated a sudden reaction to something immediate, but not necessarily to fear or disorientation. These insights confirmed earlier conclusions that he had not been experiencing a psychological episode or acting voluntarily to disappear. Long-term theories began taking clearer shape during this phase. One of the primary theories considered was that Brandon had fallen into a hidden or difficult-to-detect natural hazard. Investigators revisited older maps of the region, identifying historical features such as wells, cisterns, and agricultural pits that might have been filled improperly or covered unintentionally. These older features sometimes go unnoticed for decades, especially on land that has been repurposed or changed through farming operations. With updated maps in hand, teams checked these older sites again, though most had been filled or maintained in ways that made them unlikely hazards. Another theory involved misjudgment of distance. If Brandon had walked in a direction slightly angled away from the road grid, he could have covered more distance than initially estimated, especially if he left established roads and crossed fields directly. This scenario extended the potential search area into thousands of additional acres. Investigators recognized that the original calculations of walking radius might have underestimated the real distance, particularly if he had walked continuously for the full duration of the call. The expanded distances, however, exceeded what was reasonably searchable without new leads. Some theories introduced the possibility that Brandon had reached a body of water outside the primary search grids. While waterways near the car had been searched extensively, distant water features had not been covered with the same intensity. Investigators discussed extending searches to these farther waterways, though the task remained immense given the number of creeks, ponds, and drainage areas across the countryside. Nevertheless, each water source within a reasonable distance was eventually reviewed, though none showed evidence of disturbance. Public speculation during this period grew, fueled by the unusual nature of the disappearance. Discussions emerged regarding whether Brandon might have been struck by a vehicle, though investigators found no evidence of such an event. Others questioned whether he might have accepted a ride from someone passing through the region. However, the low traffic volume at that hour made this possibility less likely, and no reports of suspicious vehicles were documented. Despite these discussions, law enforcement maintained its focus on evidence-based possibilities. By late winter, the investigation had evolved into a long-term case defined by exhaustive searches, repeated reviews, and persistent uncertainty. Investigators continued to meet regularly, reviewing search maps, confirming which areas had been covered multiple times, and determining where future efforts might be directed. Despite the methodical approach, no new information emerged, and the disappearance remained unresolved. The winter searches concluded with the realization that even seasonal advantages, snow highlighting disturbances, frozen ground allowing access to otherwise muddy areas, and enhanced canine scent conditions, had not uncovered any leads. Each completed search cycle emphasized the same reality. The open landscape offered no indication of Brandon's location or the events that had occurred during the final moments of his phone call. By the end of the winter season, the case had firmly settled into a stage where active searching would continue periodically, but the expectation of finding immediate solutions had diminished. The sheer absence of evidence stood in contrast to the scale of the search, shaping the investigation into one of the most perplexing rural disappearances in the region's history. As the investigation into Brandon Swanson's disappearance progressed beyond its first year, it entered a phase recognized by law enforcement as long-term maintenance, an operational structure in which the case remained open and active, but measured by periodic reviews rather than continuous daily searches. Despite the extensive work already completed, investigators returned to the case repeatedly, revisiting old data, examining new technological possibilities, and consulting with specialists in missing person investigations. The absence of physical evidence continued to define the case, but each new development in forensic technology or search methodology offered an opportunity to re-evaluate what was known. The first significant effort during this long-term phase involved re-examining the cell phone data with updated analysis tools. Technology used to interpret tower connections had advanced since 2008, allowing investigators to refine the mapping of Brandon's last call. Specialists reviewed tower coverage footprints, comparing them to 2008 network conditions. They studied the technical patterns of signal bounce, tower overlap, and sector reach in rural areas, while the refined analysis narrowed the directional possibilities marginally. The results still covered a broad section of farmland. The tower near Porter remained the definitive connection point, but even with improved software, the estimated location remained a large radius encompassing multiple square miles of fields, waterways, and rural roads. The refinement affirmed earlier conclusions, but did not generate new pathways for the investigation. Investigators then revisited aerial imaging. Over the years, drone technology and enhanced aerial sensors had become more common in law enforcement. With the cooperation of state agencies, high-resolution aerial surveys were conducted across key areas of the original search radius. These surveys offered detailed views of the terrain, highlighting irregularities in soil, vegetation, and water patterns. Analysts examined these images, comparing them with older aerial photographs taken during early searches. They looked for ground disturbances, depressions, or changes in vegetation that might indicate where a person had fallen, rested, or where remains might have become obscured. None of the comparisons revealed anomalies relevant to the disappearance. Law enforcement also re-engaged cadaver dog units periodically as environmental conditions changed. Over multiple seasons and years, dogs worked through portions of the terrain, not previously accessible due to crops, flooding, or seasonal growth. Handlers brought dogs trained not only for surface scent detection, but also for locating remains buried beneath soil. These renewed efforts occasionally resulted in scent alerts, but each alert required extensive investigation, and none produced evidence related to Brandon. Sometimes the alerts were attributed to animal remains, agricultural byproducts, or natural scent traps created by terrain features. Each alert, while causing temporary hope for progress, ultimately led to dead ends. As investigators continued revisiting the landscape, they also returned to the case files in detail. Detectives reviewed dozens of interviews again, comparing early statements to later recollections. They confirmed Brandon's activities before the disappearance, re-established timelines, and re-evaluated factors such as weather conditions, visibility, and road surfaces. Every detail was examined for overlooked meaning. Forensic analysts reviewed cell phone metadata for clues hidden in call duration, signal stability, or unusual connectivity patterns. These data reviews confirmed earlier findings. The phone remained active after the abrupt end to the call, continuing to ring when dialed, which indicated it had not been immediately damaged or powered off. Yet the lack of further answers prevented investigators from forming definitive conclusions. The case continued to receive attention beyond local jurisdictions. As years passed, Brandon's disappearance appeared in national databases, missing person bulletins, and training materials for search and rescue professionals. It was often used in discussions about rural safety, nighttime disorientation, and the limitations of cell tower technology in large, open environments. True crime forums and investigative programs highlighted the case due to its unusual circumstances, bringing renewed public interest and occasionally generating new tips. Law enforcement evaluated each new tip, but none produced substantive information. During the long-term phase, investigators also sought insights from experts specializing in search theory, including academics and consultants who analyze how individuals move through terrain when disoriented. These specialists reviewed maps and timelines, focusing on the possibility that Brandon had walked in a direction angled away from expected paths, steadily increasing the radius of possible locations. Search theory suggested that small deviations in direction, maintained over long distances, could produce significantly unexpected endpoints. Investigators applied these principles to expand their maps, overlaying predicted routes with areas already searched. This analysis produced new search sectors, some of which were examined as conditions allowed. Yet again, none revealed evidence of the missing person. As years passed, investigators also re-evaluated environmental factors, such as agricultural cycles. Farmland undergoes significant alteration through tilling, planting, plowing, and harvesting each year. These processes disrupt soil layers, move surface debris, and sometimes bury or expose objects unexpectedly. Law enforcement consulted with agricultural experts and local farmers to understand how such activity could influence the presence or detection of physical evidence. Many fields within the search radius had undergone multiple cycles of tilling since 2008, meaning that small objects or shallowly buried evidence could have shifted or been incorporated into deeper soil layers. Even with this possibility, investigators found no new items and concluded that while farmland activity could obscure traces, the consistent absence of discoveries remained unusual. Throughout the years, investigators maintained communication with the Swanson family, providing updates on new searches, technological reviews, or investigative consultations. The case remained open at the state level, ensuring that any new information would be processed immediately. If unidentified remains were discovered anywhere in the region or beyond, they were cross-referenced with Brandon's profile. These checks became routine, and although several cases were examined as potential matches, all were eventually ruled out. The long-term investigation also incorporated the review of unidentified remains discovered throughout the state or in nearby regions. Advances in forensic anthropology, including genetic genealogy, were considered as possible tools should unidentified remains requiring analysis ever emerge. The Swanson case profile was periodically updated in national databases, providing accurate identifiers for future comparison. None of these measures produced relevant findings. As the investigation continued, one key reality became increasingly apparent to law enforcement. Despite the exhaustive search efforts across thousands of acres over multiple years, no physical evidence connected to the disappearance had surfaced. This absence distinguished the case from most rural missing person incidents, where belongings, tracks, or environmental disturbances usually provide some indication of direction or outcome. The case's complexity grew not from conflicting information, but from the profound lack of information. Every theory remained plausible because no evidence existed to eliminate possibilities. Investigators continued to operate under multiple working theories: environmental accident, misadventure, hidden hazard encounter, but none could be substantiated. The final moments of the phone call remained the focal point, an abrupt and unexplained end that offered no clarity about what occurred in the minutes that followed. Despite years of work, the disappearance of Brandon Swanson remained an open investigation characterized by periodic renewed efforts, evolving technology, and persistent uncertainty. The landscape where he vanished continued to offer no answers. As new seasons arrived and passed, investigators maintained their commitment. But the case remained in a long-term unresolved state, an enduring mystery within the wide expanses of Minnesota farmland. As the years continued to pass without answers, the disappearance of Brandon Swanson shifted into a stage characterized by annual case reviews, periodic search renewals, and continued public interest, driven by both the mystery itself and the structural changes it eventually inspired. The investigation never closed. Instead, it remained in the category of open missing person cases, reviewed regularly by law enforcement. Each year, as spring approached and the landscape returned to a condition similar to the night he vanished, investigators reassessed certain areas and determined whether any new ground conditions warranted additional searching. While these seasonal checks sometimes included small teams revisiting low-lying areas or waterways, the majority of renewed efforts focused on areas where environmental change had altered accessibility or visibility. Agricultural patterns played a significant role in these later searches. As farmland was plowed, tilled, or harvested each year, investigators evaluated whether soil disruption might expose items previously buried or obscured. Farmers, aware of the case and familiar with the land they cultivated, often reported any unusual findings, from discarded objects to ground irregularities. These reports were taken seriously, and investigators examined each one, though none resulted in the discovery of anything connected to Brandon. The seasonal cycle of planting and harvesting, repeated across many years, demonstrated how thoroughly the land had been worked, reinforcing the unusual nature of the complete lack of physical evidence. Law enforcement also continued to use advances in technology to revisit earlier assumptions. Search and rescue mapping software grew more sophisticated, allowing investigators to replot the likely range of movement using refined calculations. Satellite imagery provided higher resolution views of the terrain at different points. Throughout the year, thermal imaging equipment improved, offering enhanced visibility of ground conditions during aerial reviews. Yet, despite the introduction of these tools, none produced findings that moved the investigation forward. The landscape, even when viewed through modern equipment, remained unchanged in its lack of indicators. One of the most significant developments to emerge indirectly from the case was legislative change. Brandon Swanson's disappearance led to the creation and passage of Brandon's Law in Minnesota in 2009. The law established that law enforcement must immediately take a missing person report when the person is believed to be in danger, regardless of age. Prior to this legislation, missing adults were often classified under different categories that sometimes delayed search operations. The law formalized procedures, ensuring that future families would not encounter hesitations or jurisdictional limitations when reporting a loved one missing. Although this legislative shift did not produce progress in Brandon's case, it represented a tangible outcome that influenced how missing person investigations were conducted across the state. During the long-term phase, investigators continued to examine unidentified remains whenever they were found in Minnesota or surrounding regions. Each case was compared with Brandon's profile using dental records, DNA, and physical characteristics. Law enforcement maintained regular communication with national databases, ensuring that any potential match would be identified immediately. Over the years, several sets of unidentified remains were examined as possible matches, but all were ruled out through forensic analysis. The Swanson family remained actively engaged in the case throughout the years. They attended meetings with investigators, participated in search efforts, and maintained communication with the broader community. Their involvement ensured that the case continued to receive attention within local networks, keeping the investigation active, even when progress slowed. The family's persistence in publicizing the case contributed significantly to the introduction of legislative changes and helped maintain awareness among law enforcement agencies beyond their immediate region. Community involvement also played a sustained role. Residents in the rural areas surrounding the search radius remained watchful, reporting anything unusual found during fieldwork, property maintenance, or seasonal changes. Hunters crossing large stretches of farmland kept the case in mind as they moved through less accessible areas during fall seasons. Despite this long-term vigilance, no new information emerged. As time passed, the consistency of the absence became a defining feature remarkable in its own way, yet offering no resolution. Investigators also considered how the environment might have changed in the years since the disappearance. Portions of the land had shifted through natural erosion or changes in water pathways. Drainage systems installed or replaced since 2008 could have altered the terrain beneath the surface. Some fields had been reworked, soil redistributed, and ground levels adjusted for agricultural needs. These environmental transformations made it increasingly difficult to rely on assumptions formed early in the investigation. However, even with the possibility of environmental change, the absence of any visible evidence continued to perplex authorities. As the years accumulated, the case became frequently referenced in training materials and investigative discussions related to rural missing person incidents. Experts examining the file noted the unusual combination of factors: a young man in stable condition, a detailed timeline of his movements, an extended phone call documenting his walk through the landscape, and an abrupt disappearance without even the smallest physical trace. Such cases are rare, and the Swanson disappearance became an example used to illustrate the limits of search technology, the complexities of rural environments, and the unpredictable nature of disorientation at night. Regular case reviews persisted. Each review involved analyzing the original search efforts, rechecking timelines, and confirming that no evidence had been missed. Investigators also re-examined whether foul play could be a factor, despite the lack of evidence pointing in that direction. No credible indicators ever emerged to support that hypothesis. There were no reports of suspicious activity in the region, no signs of struggle near the vehicle, and no evidence of other individuals being present in the early morning hours. Without evidence, the criminal theory remained possible, but unsupported. As more than a decade passed, the disappearance of Brandon Swanson remained one of the most puzzling, unresolved cases in Minnesota. The land where he vanished continued to be accessible, open, and worked regularly, yet nothing had surfaced. The timeline of the phone call remained the most concrete element of the case, with the final moment still unexplained. Every investigator who reviewed the case returned to the same point. Brandon was walking, speaking normally, navigating the environment as best he could, and then reacted suddenly to something in his immediate surroundings. The silence that followed offered no clues. Today, the case remains open, and law enforcement continues to process new information whenever it appears. Investigators reaffirm that the file will not be closed until definitive answers are found. The absence of evidence has not reduced the commitment to the case. Rather, it has sustained the question of how someone could vanish so completely within an environment that has been so thoroughly examined. The disappearance stands unresolved, defined not by conflicting accounts or complex narratives, but by a timeline that ends quietly, without physical trace, in the early morning darkness of rural Minnesota. It remains one of the region's most enduring mysteries, a case shaped by vast landscapes, limited clues, and a final moment that has yet to be explained.